Alright friends, these videos can get a bit long. I don't want to waste anyone's time. I know what everyone is here for, so let's just get right to it. Let's talk about Spider-Man. Everyone knows who Spider-Man is. This guy is objectively, probably, definitely, sort of, the most popular superhero on the Earth planet. More popular than God, probably. So, obviously, we all know his story. So, what's Spider-Man's story? Obviously, Spider-Man is a high school kid named Peter Miles Morales. A high school kid who becomes a crime-fighting superhero, and the first real supervillain he fights is obviously the Green Goblin. And he falls in love with the famously dark-headed Mary Jane Watson, you know, obviously. So that bit was a little silly, right? And not just because I wrote this joke months ago before No Way Home came out and made it all a little bit too obvious. Because in real life, people generally know enough about comics and movies made about comics that this is not so confusing. Even if you don't know a single thing about Spider-Man, you're likely not going to be confused about the concept of there being different versions of him. Having different versions of different stories is just a thing that happens everywhere nowadays, and then multiply that by tenfold when it comes to comic book characters. And you, as someone who lives nowadays, know enough about how that works that you can be like, oh, there was a Spider-Man movie franchise a while back where whatever happened, and then they rebooted that and recast Spider-Man with a different actor, and then a few years later they did that again, and all these are different Spider-Man stories made by different writers and directors, and we're not confused when these stories don't line up because we understand this process. We, as modern movie-watching, book-reading nerds, can be told different versions of a story, and we get it because we have or can easily find out the context behind these differences. Sure, the context is a little complicated, but we still have the context. Hold that thought, remember that word. I'll be coming back to it a lot. I'm gonna repeat the word context so much in this video that it might lose all meaning for you, but hopefully it doesn't because it's important. Comic books are sometimes described by people who take this sort of thing way too seriously as modern-day mythology, which does a lot to make our favorite spandex-clad cartoon characters feel very epic and important. But what I don't often see happening, and what I personally think would help a lot of readers to understand both mediums better, is to apply that logic in reverse, as in to think of mythology as ancient comic books. I mean, they're obviously not literally ancient comic books, but they are ancient literature. And no matter how ancient, literature is rarely as abstruse and unknowable as you might think. See, I feel like a lot of people, even people who know mythology really well, still have this overly sacred or idealized impression of mythology where, like, these are stories about gods, right? These are stories about historical gods that historical people actually worshipped, and they told these stories to make sense of natural forces that they didn't fully understand. So there's this instinct to treat such stories as reverentially as the Bible or the sutras, which then leads to mental wires getting crossed when we have to deal with the actual golden rule about mythology, and Greek mythology in particular, which is that there is no Bible for mythology that all of ancient Greece followed, or any other canon set in stone, and so you are going to find myths with many different versions or ones that flatly contradict each other. Aphrodite is called Zeus's daughter by a super important poet, but was also born from sky balls, according to another super important poet. The hunter Orion was killed by Artemis in one story, but by Gaia in another. The huntress, Atalanta, sometimes sails with the Argonauts and sometimes doesn't. Apollo has a music contest with Pan, or maybe it was the satyr Messias instead. So on, so forth. And the thing is that we run into this as well when we read comic books, right? Longtime nerds know that what is or isn't canon in the big two comics companies changes from day to day, writer to writer, and the best you can hope for when it comes to continuity is that no one fucks it up too badly, and the worst that you might expect is that your favorite character one day just up and gets erased from existence for whatever reason. Basically, dealing with canon in popular media can be frustrating and confusing, but we're not often confused about what it is or why it happens. We know that a Spider-Man comic book does not spring forth into being from out of nowhere. Someone has to write it, and because we have a lot of comic books, a lot of different people write different ones about the same characters at different times. And so some story details are going to be different. Again, just to stress this point, a big context behind there being inconsistencies in comic book stories is that different people write them. An additional context to consider is that sometimes different people write them for different mediums, like film and TV, so that even the same overall character depicted might just feel like a whole different person living a whole different life when they appear in different stories. Now, I hope it doesn't feel like I'm talking down to people like y'all are helpless babies who don't understand simple things, but the whole point that I'm trying to illustrate is that these are very rudimentary concepts to us that we modern people just sort of instinctively know about our favorite comic book characters or movie franchises or TV shows or what have you without having to think about it too much. And I can't speak for everyone else, but again, something that really helps me personally to wrap my head around a lot of mythological stories is to take all of that, all of the everything that we just talked about, and just apply all of that context onto mythology. Imagine your favorite modern author of your favorite book series or the director whose work you always seem to enjoy, and just transplant those people 2,000-ish years into the past. And I think a lot of what usually confuses people about mythology just starts to make much more sense. Like, oh, that explains why there are different versions of one thing, or oh, I kind of see now why this god or hero acted in this seemingly strange way. Because sure, these are gods, but they are also functionally fictional characters whose stories and characterizations rest on the whims of some dude trying to impress the audience at open mic night. Some of those dudes might even have something they specifically wanted to say about these characters. And I should probably make it clear that for the purposes of these videos, yes, I'm approaching mythology from the evidence-based position of these gods and stories being fictional creations and not existing supernatural divine beings. I know that Hellenic polytheism was a living religion whose aspects have been reconstructed today, and so there are people today who believe in the Greek gods, and I love that. I love that for you guys. I've looked into that a little bit for myself, but again, as far as this video essay is concerned, I'm looking at these stories of gods and heroes and monsters in a more anthropological light, as if they are 100% made-up stories made up by ancient authors. Please do not smite me, gods. And yes, I'm basically suggesting that we compare these ancient Greek storytellers to people like Stan Lee or George Lucas, and I almost don't want to do that because that kind of makes those guys sound super epic, as if I'm saying that they're on the artistic level of legendary historical masters or something. To be fair, I'm not saying that, but whether they are or not isn't actually my point. My point is that mythology about Aphrodite walking out of sea foam and Apollo rap-battling satyrs did not spring forth from nothing either. A real live human person said it out loud, and then someone else told the story again to someone else, and at some point someone wrote it down. A real live ancient person, a storyteller, someone like Stan Lee or George Lucas in the abstract, sat at their ancient person workstation and wrote down stories just like people write down stories now, and that's where our modern knowledge of mythology comes from. But unfortunately, the further we go back in time, the more we lose the contextual familiarity with media that we have with our modern works. Like, we all know who Medusa is, right? Just like we all know who Spider-Man is. But if I asked you, where did the story of Medusa come from? Who wrote it down? When did they write it down? You probably wouldn't know off the top of your head, and even I would have to go and double check just to make sure I'm not getting it wrong, because that sort of thing is just not part of our general pool of common knowledge, which makes the whole scope of mythology seem that much more nebulous and vague, like it really did just always exist or simply popped into existence from nothingness. Which it didn't. We do know the sources. We can, in fact, just look them up. On the flip side, the fact that a lot of this information is so compiled and collated nowadays, along with the fact that a lot of us probably learned about mythology from very collated compilations of stories, makes this all seem very organized and detailed, which sure makes things more convenient for us learners, but also feeds into the impression of the stories about Zeus and Athena, etc., as having come from something like a Bible or at least a source book that just has everything you need to know in it. And I've made this mistake too, because we today are so used to fictional fantasy and sci-fi settings having very in-depth world building that all connects together very cohesively, and I myself have to constantly resist the urge to treat the ancient mythology I read like a D&D rulebook with exact creature types and power levels and whatnot, because that's one of the few key ways that mythology does differ from a lot of modern fantasy fiction, where even the most complicated fantasy settings at least try to have something of an official canon, even if it does change from time to time. Mythology does not have official set canon. No writer or publishing company owned characters like Perseus and Athena. They were just entities that everyone told stories about, and no one ever decided that there were any established canonical details about them set in stone that these stories had to follow or else. Imagine how much Spider-Man has changed in the time that you have known about Spider-Man, and he's only been around for less than 60 years. Imagine how much Spider-Man would change in hundreds of years, especially if he was a public domain character without official editors managing what they want his set canon to be. If you retain only one single bit of information from this video, it should be that mythology has no set canon. Aphrodite is Zeus's daughter, and she was also born from sea foam. Mythology has no set canon, so both are right, neither myth is incorrect. Mythology has no set canon. 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 But, mythology does have context. Mythology has no set canon, but that's not the same as saying that we view all mythology through the same lens, because context is key. I find context very important to understanding mythology, on top of being maybe the most interesting part of reading mythology, and I'll try to explain why. When I say context, what I mean is who wrote this, when did they write this, and finally, what was it written for? And so some of the most important context about mythology is that they were just written down by various writers just writing things. These people weren't priests or prophets. They were career performers or authors, which, to be fair, weren't exactly just like the performers or authors we have today, but there's also not a dramatic, impenetrable difference either. Ancient writers are not literally Neil Gaiman or Christopher Nolan, but they're kind of what Nolan or Gaiman would have been back then. And the ancient Greek people who read these myths or saw them being performed would be very aware of this context of the fact that their mythology is being presented to them through human sources, and they therefore would not find it strange when, for instance, someone's poem doesn't exactly match up with someone else's poem, because that context is just a normal part of their lives, just like how we today don't find it that strange when there are 3 or more different Spider-Mans. But hold on, Brian, you goddamn son of a bitch, you say. How can we say that ancient mythology was treated just like our modern entertainment? I mean, stuff like Inception or The Sandman is just entertainment and not religion. We know it's made up and no one seriously worships Dream of the Endless. On the other hand, people believed in Zeus and Athena and Apollo. Worship in these beings was a big deal, so how can it be just like reading comics or watching TV? Well, that leads to the second major thing to remember about mythology, which is that mythology is not the same thing as religion. Mythology is the stories and folklore you told about your religious figures to entertain yourself with, and these stories may or may not have had anything at all to do with how ancient people actually worships or understands their gods. In fact, a person could worship a god without engaging with their stories at all. A very simple example is with Hestia, goddess of the hearth. Hearth. It's pronounced hearth. I always pronounce it hearth because it looks like, I know it looks like heart with an H at the end, but it also looks like earth with an H at the beginning, and we don't call it planet Earth. Anyway, basically everyone worshipped Hestia in ancient Greece. She gets mentioned first and last during all ceremonies and feasts. She's very important in a ceremonial and ritualistic context, as in the religious context, and she basically has no associated mythology. There's like one story about her ever, and it's from Rome and not Greece. So that's a very easy example of how a god can be widely worshipped in daily ancient life without their myths playing any part at all. That's sort of what I mean when I say that mythology is not religion. Religion encompasses someone's real-life practices and beliefs in the divine forces of the world that affect their day-to-day real life. And so it's entirely possible to worship the gods of your people, your local community, your general culture without knowing or following the extra details of these characters' life stories like some kind of ongoing radio play. Now, yes, a lot of myths were told in order to teach religion or religious themes, and sometimes stories can become outright enmeshed into a culture's religion. But remember, a lot of what we'd consider mythology is just the equivalent of ancient Greek Zack Snyder's writing stories to entertain, and no one is worshipping Zack Snyder's writing as if they're cult doctrines, I think. So, like, some of these technically legendary stories about gods and heroes did come from historical religious texts and hymns and whatnot, but the rest of them were poems and theater plays. Basically the ancient equivalent of, I don't know, the Constantine movie with Keanu Reeves or Dogma starring Jay and Silent Bob, which incorporate religious mythology like angels and demons and gods to tell an exciting story with, and they can certainly teach you lessons about the religion in question, but whether or not they had anything to do with what people actually believed or practiced with their living religion is very questionable. Which is not to say that these poems and theater plays did not have any religious significance, because unfortunately there are no easy answers here, so of course they did. In fact, most of theater in ancient Greece was written for religious festivals in honor of the gods, and specifically Dionysus. And I do not want to downplay and really should probably be trying to emphasize the fact that oral tradition is inextricably intertwined with the religion and spirituality of ancient Greece, and that telling stories about their gods and culture heroes is how religious practices survived and were passed down through the years, on top of just doing that thing that stories do, which is to teach lessons about things like how to be humble and to treat people well and to not be a douchebag or else you'll get turned into a horse. The Greeks also treated artistic inspiration in and of itself as a divine gift sent directly from the gods, and at one point it became kind of trendy among poets to claim that the muses had literally visited them in person to grant them the words to speak, which might sound a wee bit boastful, like, ooh, I'm so helpful, I got the help of the muses and you didn't. But I guess it's also another way to say that they owed all their success to these goddesses, which is the opposite of boastful. It's like how every actor or director or athlete nowadays thanks capital G God when they win a Video Music Award or whatever. I mean, you're boasting, but religiously. So yes, writing stories about the gods and then performing those stories about the gods in festivals intended to honor the gods was shockingly a somewhat religious activity. What I'm trying to explain, though, is that no matter how intertwined a piece of literature might be with religion or even religious themes, the audience of the time would still have had more than enough context about who wrote these mythological works, when they were written, and why they were written, and that would have affected their understanding of these works in the same way that our contextual understanding of modern fiction affects our understanding of that. Imagine you're an ancient Athenian theatergoer who just saw the new performance of Oedipus Rex by the playwright Sophocles for the first time, and you're like, holy shit, this is some intense stuff. This is riveting and dramatic. It even ends differently, more tragically than how stories about Oedipus had previously ended. How would you then incorporate this play you just saw into your beliefs about the gods and the divine world? Remember, you know that some guy named Sophocles wrote this play. You have that context. You know that Sophocles is a playwright currently living in Athens, just like you or any other Athenian. You might have flat out met Sophocles before. So you're probably not thinking, man, why did Sophocles get Oedipus's continuity wrong? While you probably are thinking, wow, Sophocles came up with a new interpretation of Oedipus' story that's a little different from how it was before, which is cool and thought-provoking. Or possibly you might think it sucks. I don't know. Art is subjective. So, to re-emphasize, ancient Greek mythology is not ancient Greek religion, although sometimes a culture's mythology can start to bleed into its impression of its own religion, which is simply what happens when your art is just that popular. Art is culture. It shapes culture and vice versa in both obvious and non-obvious ways. The biggest examples of this happening as far as Greek mythology goes were probably with the poets Homer and Hesiod. They're basically the two most foundational influencers of Greek mythology and religion. Homer wrote the Iliad, which was about the Trojan War, and the Odyssey, which is about Odysseus, and these are some of the oldest surviving accounts of literature, period. They were considered ancient even by the standards of ancient Greece, so even the ancient Greeks were like, ooh, these are important and cool cultural artifacts. That means we Greeks make cool and important cultural artifacts. Yay! And at more or less, probably, possibly, sort of, we think maybe the same time, maybe, but actually probably a little bit later, theoretically, Hesiod was writing the Theogony, which was like I said earlier that there's no Bible for Greek mythology, but the Theogony gets as close as you can get as far as being a coherent account of the creation of the world and the gods and mankind, and gives a pretty clear genealogy for everyone and everything that could possibly be important in this funky little world. You know, that whole thing with Gaia giving birth to the Titans who overthrew Uranus, and the whole thing with Zeus and his siblings overthrowing his father Kronos and establishing the Olympian rule. This was that whole thing. Again, whether or not it had any direct one-to-one racial impact on the Greek religion and worship of the time is kind of debatable. Like, worship of the individual gods like Zeus and Poseidon already existed and had very detailed religions by this time, and do you really need to know the in-depth world building and intricacies of a god's family background and lineage in order to worship them for their godly functions? Do you really need to watch every single other 25 MCU films just to watch Shang-Chi? Probably not, right? But still, we suddenly got this vivid narrative account of the lives of the divinities and the wars in heaven between fathers and sons, titans and Olympians, and that did a lot to spark the imaginations of other writers and philosophers to come. Now, again, both Hesiod's and Homer's writings were very likely compiled, if not adapted, from the general spoken folklore that people may have already known and passed around at the time. It's just that they made it all very conveniently compiled, and so but these works, by merit of just being very well known and convenient, became this sort of lightning rod, lighthouse on a cliff, anchor point metaphor thing that most other subsequent writers would branch off of and use as inspiration for their works. Which is a little bit ironic considering that Homer and Hesiod, you guessed it, contradict each other a bunch of times. Remember that whole thing with Aphrodite? Yeah, this is that, among other things. Homer said that she's Zeus's daughter with an obscure Titan goddess called Dione, while Hesiod is the one who says that she rose from sea foam after Uranus's genitals were cut off and thrown into the sea. That's the context. One writer wrote down one thing, another wrote down something else. Which one is true? Again, as I said earlier, the technically correct, appropriate answer to that question is that both are true, neither is false. This is fiction, these are fake made-up stories about fictional characters. It doesn't matter which version you like better. Mythology has no set canon. But that's a dumb, boring answer, right? We ain't handing out no participation trophies here, and just because neither story is wrong doesn't mean that both are equally convincing. And this is where context continues to be useful for us to have, because one context to consider was that Homer had a tendency to not depict Aphrodite very flatteringly. If you read the Iliad, Aphrodite was characterized as a very silly, flighty, almost inept goddess who was the cause of all the problems, and even the people whose side she was on were kind of fed up with her shenanigans. Every other god and goddess seemed to get their own moment to shine and step up to the plate during the Trojan War, while Aphrodite kind of gets singled out as a bit more second-rate. Now, Hesiod didn't write a whole lot of Aphrodite, but even the little bit that he has written of her just generally comes across a lot more respectable and impressive than Homer's rendition, which is impressive considering how much of a raging misogynist that Hesiod was otherwise. So here we have some of the very first instances of authorial bias in history. I mean, does the fact that Homer makes fun of Aphrodite while Hesiod doesn't mean that Homer's telling of her lineage is somehow less good or valid? Not really, but it is something to consider. It is context, and it affects our reading. Given the context, it's not really surprising then that the overwhelming majority of ancient audiences at the time, and literally every modern reader I've seen, prefers Hesiod's version over Homer's, wherein Aphrodite had no real parents and instead rose majestically from the ocean after her spontaneous creation from genitals. Like, the bias is very clear here. Seaborn Aphrodite evidently was and still is just much more mythically appealing to the general audience than the idea of a poor little girl Aphrodite crying to her mommy after she got her ass kicked by some guy on the battlefield, which is what happens in Homer's Iliad. That's the literal only time we ever see Aphrodite interact with her supposed mother Dione in all of known mythology. And I don't want to throw Homer under the bus here. I think we can come up with any number of narrative or thematic reasons why his portrayal of Aphrodite was appropriate for the story he wanted to tell. The Iliad is much more of an intimate, character-based soap opera than the Theogony, which is a lot more abstract and larger than life, and presenting Aphrodite as someone with a mother who she goes to when she is sad does a bit to humanize her and bring these godly events down to an emotional level that people can empathize with, which is also an important facet of these ancient stories. But you can't really argue with popular opinion. Believe me, I have tried. And in this instance of there being two versions of a myth, one version, the one without genitals, just ended up a little less compelling than the other. It's like how the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man got a pretty bum rap before No Way Home made everyone like him again. But sometimes things just don't work out for a story, even if they did have a lot of redeeming qualities. I mean, look at this scene. How cool was this scene? Yeah, that's right, I'm doing the thing where I always liked the thing y'all hated before y'all decided you didn't hate it anymore. It's pretty much my signature move. Sorry. And as far as Homer and Hesiod goes, the reverse can be true as well. If you know Eris, the goddess of discord, the one who tossed the golden apple of discord that started the whole Trojan War, well, Homer calls her Ares' sister, and this might actually just be a poetic description, like strife is the sister of war or something. But he doesn't mention her being Zeus and Hera's daughter, although people generally assume that is what he means. Now, Hesiod, on the other hand, says that Eris is the daughter of Nyx, the knight. And everyone usually defers to what Hesiod says about these gods' lineages because he was the lineage guy. But in this case, Nyx isn't really a character in these stories. She doesn't really do anything. So her being the mother of discord felt kind of boring. It's just not as dramatic an interpretation as the goddess of discord being an actual blood-related member of the Olympian court and, like, causing trouble with her brother Ares, like the black sheep of the family that they are. And so, in both ancient and modern interpretations, readers generally like to go with Homer's vague poetic telling, to the point that I don't think most people nowadays even know that Eris has another origin. So the big point I wanted to make there was that every mythological story has its own context, and not every context is equally compelling. With Homer and Hesiod, we can see that even with these couple of preeminent MVP epic poems that classical Greece held in the highest esteem, people still viewed certain elements of one story more favorably than they did with the other. Like, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Theogony are some of the most Greek myths to ever Greek myth, and even then, audiences did not just unquestioningly regurgitate them without thinking. They analyzed them just like we would and picked and chose the parts that resonated with them. So there's a contextual hierarchy to mythology, and if even the ones that sit at the top of that hierarchy weren't immune from scrutiny and weren't just blindly absorbed by the masses, imagine how much more carefully we have to analyze the surviving myths that weren't national epics or award-winning theater shows. I'm gonna get a lot of flack for saying this, but not every myth that we know of today is equally legit. First of all, not all of the people of every region of ancient Greece knew every single myth ever told in their time, especially considering that a lot of myths were very localized and isolated, and as seen above, they didn't even agree on the ones that they did know, and that's not even considering the different sects and offshoots, and that is not even considering how much all these different offshoots changed over time. Our compiled knowledge of Greek mythology did not just come from one single century of works or even a couple centuries of stuff. It comes from basically 3 millenniums worth of scribbled notes and barely legible pottery dating back from Bronze Age island civilizations to the last remnants of paganism in a Roman Empire that was slowly but surely finding Jesus. And so a lot of the things that we today think of as Greek mythology or as elements of Greek mythology were probably not treated all that seriously at the time by its audience. A lot of them had very dubious sources passed down second or third or fourth hand, or maybe came from one single person from Podunk Nowheresville who said something about a god or a hero at some point, and it only gets counted as mythology nowadays by sheer merit of being lucky enough to have been written down. That's how basic the standard for mythology is, by the way. Something was written down, and today it's considered mythology. That's all it takes. I have to stress this, and I actually cannot stress this enough, that many versions of what has become pretty standardly accepted interpretations of mythology or mythological figures just came from completely random writers writing completely random things. And I'm gonna give you my favorite example of this. Google Greek myth 2 bodies. Do it right now, go ahead. Okay. You're going to find a lot of links to a lot of articles and even other video essays of this myth of the origin of soulmates that has become pretty en vogue recently. Percy Jackson fans will know this one because it actually ended up getting referenced in that pretty good book in the Heroes of Olympus series. The gist is that, according to Greek mythology, humankind was originally created by the gods with 2 heads, 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 sets of genitals. Some of the genitals were in the sausage donut configuration, others were sausage, and others were donut. These 8-limbed, multi-genitaled humans were so powerful that they scared Zeus, who then split all people in half to reduce their power by half, while also doubling the amount of worship that the gods would receive. Wait, so you've halved the power of an individual person, but you've also doubled the amount of people. Doesn't that just mean that humans end up with the same amount? Okay, never mind. So from then on, humans only had 1 head, 2 arms, 2 legs, and 1 sausage and or donut per groin, and we're always instinctively searching for our other half, who is our soulmate, the part of ourselves that we got separated from. People who were originally part of a double sausage monstrosity would be searching for their other half with the sausage parts, and so on and so forth with the donuts and the combo breakers. And this, according to Greek mythology, is why we have soulmates, straight people, and gay people in the world. What about asexual people, you ask? It's easy to see why this particular fable gained a lot of traction lately with people just discovering mythology and also with progressive-leaning online circles. It's a very attention-grabbing story that explains the existence of true love between destined soulmates and has the added bonus of being pretty queer-friendly even by the standards of a mythos that was already notably pretty queer-friendly. Do y'all want to know the actual context of this myth? Who wrote it, when it was written, what it was written for, etc.? Well, Plato wrote this down in his catalog of speeches called the Symposium. So, okay, Plato is a pretty important philosopher, apparently, and the Symposium is a pretty important work. It's basically a big old rumination on the many different types of love, erotic, platonic love. This is where we get the word platonic from Plato, and also heavenly and earthly love. I'm backtracking a little bit here, but there's even a part where Plato considers that there might be two Aphrodites to coincide with there being two different expressions of love, earthly and heavenly, which explains her two different origins. Anyway, you get the point. It's a big philosophy discussion told in the form of dialogues between different people that were actually based on real actual figures from classical Greece, like Socrates and Aristophanes. Plato ended up writing a bunch of these types of dialogues, which, just to be clear, are not documentaries. These are very much fictional. Those people didn't actually say any of these speeches. Plato just wrote these dialogues as an intellectual exercise, as in, what if a bunch of these famous people actually did get together at a symposium and talk to each other about love? Little bit of extra context. A symposium in classical Greece was basically a private party. It's a social event someone hosts where you get together with a bunch of friends and you lounged about and shot the shit and you drank some watered wine and there might be some snacks and there also might be some prostitutes. It's a man party. So, just to be perfectly clear, so we're all on the same page so far. This widely circulated Greek myth about the origin of soulmates and gay sex came from one guy writing real person fanfiction about what would happen if famous people that he likes got together at a man party. In modern terms, it might be a bit like someone writing an article in Times Magazine about James Cameron and Harry Styles giving speeches about love while they were getting drunk at Spike Lee's house. Oh, and we're not done yet with the context. See, the actual part of the symposium that this soulmates myth is from is a fictional speech from the aforementioned Aristophanes. Aristophanes was a comedy writer. Aristophanes wrote a lot of comic plays and satire plays and even political parodies that contained thinly veiled commentaries or outright insults against the public figures of his time. He wrote plays with choruses acting as frogs, with birds rising up to oppose the gods, about women who refused to have sex with their husbands until those husbands stopped fighting wars, and also about poop. A lot of poop. And a fictional depiction of this man is the source that Plato has delivering the myth about sausage monsters and soulmates in his think piece fanfiction, The Symposium. Now, does the fact that this section of Plato's work come from comedy writer Aristophanes mean that it's supposed to be taken more humorously than the other sections? I don't know. There's only so much that we can reasonably speculate about that. But I bet that when I first started talking about this Greek myth about how destined soulmates were once one person that got split into two, you did not expect that it came from a fictional account of the ancient equivalent of Sacha Baron Cohen getting drunk at a party and then spilling tea. this is not me ragging on the symposium. The symposium is an important piece of literature and a thought-provoking look at how ancient people treated the very concept of love. But the idea that this section of it has become retold in our time as Greek mythology, like the mythology of the Greek people, is insane. Like, no one believed this. Why would they? It's not religion or even folklore. One person imagined a fake version of another person saying a speech, and I guess it passes the threshold of what a Greek myth is by virtue of being a story that someone told, but that just ignores every other bit of context surrounding it. And that's just one example of a widely circulated myth that didn't come from as solid a source as you might have expected. Most of the others don't get taken as outrageously out of context as this one did. Like, to be fair, this was a pretty extreme instance, but the general trend itself is pretty widespread. You especially have to watch out for the etiological myths, which are the origin stories, stories that describe why things are the way that they are, the ones that go, this guy stole some bread and got turned into a raccoon, and that's why there are raccoons in the world today. Now, unfortunately, that's still a pretty broad category that contains like 95% of Greek mythology, where a lot of people got turned into a lot of things, and those were the etiological explanations for why those things existed. And we can actually source a lot of this particular trend to the Roman poet Ovid. We'll get back to Ovid. He's a name to remember as well. Although this whole genre of detailing every single origin story of every little thing from cities and constellations to partridges and wildflowers was pretty common even before Ovid, probably explains why everyone today just accepted Plato's whole soulmate story without a second thought. It just kind of blends into the whole mass origin story potpourri of mythology and was probably intentionally modeled after the common tropes that those stories had. See, that's the other thing. So many people were telling and writing etiological stories back then that it almost feels like some sort of mass cultural ritual, or even some sort of shared genetic tendency of ancient humans to want to tell these specific types of stories. But if you ask me, a lot of it might have also just been people copying each other, chasing trends, kinda. Stories that become popular become the trendsetters and the genre archetypes. We see this kind of thing today all the time. Everyone wanted to be the next Battlestar Galactica, and then they all wanted to be the next Breaking Bad, or The Walking Dead, or Game of Thrones. If you asked readers from 2,000 years in the future to analyze our current media, I bet they would spot a whole lot of tropes like dead parent figures or obligatory love interests and dark mirror villains that make it seem as if humans of the second millennium had some sort of mass penchant for writing that stuff in their stories, which isn't completely wrong, but may just be another way to say that everyone was copying everyone else's homework. And not even in a bad way, we just like those types of stories that people were telling, and we all want our stories to be as good. I don't think ancient storytellers were all that different, and it also didn't have to come from an intentional desire to copy other storytellers. It's just writers using the tropes that they knew in the way that they knew worked. And it turned out that every story ended up having a mortal who was doing some kind of bad thing, and then an angry god turned them into a raccoon because, of course, they did. That's just what happens. Again, I find that a lot of the things that might seem peculiar about mythology becomes a lot less peculiar when you try to imagine them from the mindset of our modern genre storytellers. And look, etiological myths can be very interesting glimpses into the mindsets of a culture, and a lot of our understanding of mythological themes and ideas are pieced together from all these assortments of little stories gathered from here and there and all over the map of the ancient world. You just have to be very cognizant of the fact that these are random assortments of little folktales that can come from any random source through any random context imaginable. And on the one hand, yes, they could have been so ingrained into the culture as to shape the very course of its religions. Or on the other hand, they might just have been someone's personal blog entries taken entirely out of context. Another one of these examples that stands out to me is the origin story of the Lamia. If you Google Lamia, you'll come across a bunch of images of basically a Naga woman, human from the waist up, but a big snake from the waist down. She's kind of become woven into the standard fantasy monster bestiary like a lot of other things from Greek myths. So, what's her story? Well, the general consensus, if you look around the internet, is that she was a queen of Libya who slept around with Zeus, but then Zeus's wife Hera found out and then killed all of Lamia's children. This caused Lamia to go mad with grief, which made it so that she went around killing a bunch of other women's children, which then, being such a monstrous act, physically transformed Lamia into a monster. Okay, well, it's on the gruesome side of Greek myths, but there have been a few others that have been at least within the same ballpark of gruesome. Anyway, you guys have been paying attention, right? You know what the next question is, right? What's the context? Who wrote it? When did they write it? And why did they write it? Well, let's see. Lamia's Wikipedia entry is a bit of a fucking mess. All kinds of stuff is happening here, and a lot of sources talk about this myth of Hera killing Lamia's children and then her turning into a monster from it. But from what we can tell, the only actual source for that particular origin is from a historian called Durus of Samos, who wrote about it in one of his more obscure works. And that's it. There you go. This is the only time that we see any source for this version of Lamia. Oh, people would reference this origin story that Durus gave to Lamia in later references to Lamia, but this specific guy is where everyone else got their scoop from, and now it's just become the de facto front page headline story for this particular mythological monster. Which is curious because the Lamia itself, as a concept, was far older than Durus. She was mentioned by other writers at least 300 years before Durus's time. He didn't create her, he was just the first one that we know of to write down her origin story. Now, we think that Durus was dutifully recounting the spoken folklore and the general cultural knowledge that people might have had about Lamia from his time, but there's basically no way to know for sure. No way to know where he got these details about Lamia sleeping with Zeus and the Hera killing children thing. One guy said it. One guy ever wrote it down. That's it. So here's what probably happened, and yes, the word probably is doing a bit of work for me here, but bear with me because this is kind of a conglomeration of everything we've talked about so far. Whatever origin story that Lamia may or may not have had before Durus, or whenever whoever Durus heard his story from, she was probably just one of the many generically scary, monstrous folklore boogie women that ancient Greek mothers would frighten their naughty children with. Like, if you don't pick up your toys, then the Lamia will come and get you. There were, in fact, a couple of these types of vampiric, demonic snake women, like the Mormo or the Empusa, and even the Gorgons, who we'll touch on soon as well. And like the Empusai, Lamia may have also have been originally pluralized as a whole race of monsters like vampires or werewolves. So instead of telling your bratty kids that there was just one woman named Lamia, you'd instead say that there were a whole bunch of monstrous Lamias out there in the world. So what we have here is basically an ancient Greek horror story monster, right? Right up to having some horror monster shtick, like being able to take out her own eyes and put them back in, which is apparently a thing she did. And then someone at some point, may have been Duras, may have been before Duras, wanted to tell a definitive story about a Lamia singular, so now she's a more defined singular monster that has her own etiological origin story, like Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, instead of like a xenomorph alien, which is a bit more vague. And let's just be real that this person probably took a lot of familiar tropes into account when he came up with this new origin story. Let's be real that this Lamia origin is kind of a mythological pastiche and borrows just about every one of its own beats from other earlier stories. Because that's just what you do, right? You work with what you know with the stories that you've been taught yourself. And everyone knows that Zeus goes around sleeping with beautiful women, and everyone knows that Hera goes around being angry at those women, and then everyone knows that you gotta end up with a human turning into something else as a punishment. So you just cram all those tropes into your telling, and voila, your new Greek myth is as Greek and as mythical as any Greek myth ever was. And you even get the added bonus of this horror monster's own origin story being a bit of a mini horror story in itself, where like, don't sleep around, girls, or else Hera will kill all your kids and turn you into a steak woman. Now, the end result is, again, a bit more grisly even by the standards of what generally ends up happening in these stories. But remember that this one in particular is not a religious hymn or a philosophical treatise, which can already get pretty grim, dark, and edgelordy. This one is a horror story, and it's going to go a little bit more beyond the pale than even what we're already used to. So if you felt like this Lamia story seemed to depict the gods and their punishments in an even more extreme or unsympathetic light than usual, well, remember the context. Think of the stuff that we have today with our Saw franchises or human caterpillar stuff, and it's like, if we're depicting that kind of stuff today for entertainment and thrills, what makes you think that ancient storytellers wouldn't have done the same? See, the other big, major, mostly true impression that people have about mythology is about how dark it is and how merciless the gods are and how gruesome it can get with all the assaults and the murders. And I've read a lot of very educated explanations for why the myths were like this, like how mythology is about exploring anxieties and depicting the cruelties and the wrongs that are the most memorable to us. Like, yeah, stories about gods being so petty and cruel touch upon our own anxieties about pettiness and cruelty and how wrong it would be for a god to act in this way. These sorts of depictions of these types of things evoke strong responses from the audience and therefore end up being the ones that are retold the most. But also, like, isn't that the exact sort of thing that we do today? Writing stories of gruesome horrors and cosmic injustices? You can't tell me that if storytellers like Joss Whedon or George R.R. Martin were born back in ancient times, they wouldn't also be writing about petty gods and lots of sex crimes. Did something in an ancient story you heard of once strike you as particularly unwholesome or cruel? Well, imagine that it was written by ancient Frank Miller or ancient Mark Miller. For a lot of storytellers, a lot of stories are about taking things to their worst logical conclusions, depicting a world that fills you with the most memorable frustrations, and they might do this to say something about the world, or maybe they just do this because that's simply the type of storytellers that they are, and that's going to be true no matter the century that they were born in. And with that in mind, let's talk about Medusa. How do I even begin to explain Medusa? Well, in a lot of ways, I shouldn't have to, right? Medusa might actually be the most well-known Greek mythology thing. Like, it's entirely possible for someone in this day and age to know as much, if not more, about this snake-haired monster lady as they know about the major gods and heroes. There's simply something that's alarmingly unforgettable about the concept of a monster that turns you into stone if you just looked at her face. Add in snakes for hair, and it's like A+ visual design, ancient mythology. Pennywise is shooketh. Pinheads and leatherheads can sit right down. Your faves could literally never. And you better believe the ancient Greeks had a lot to say about her as well, since, make no mistake, this was not one of those one-off regional stories I'd mentioned that you'd only find in the margins of some obscure poet's rough drafts. No, the story of Medusa and her defeat by Perseus, son of Zeus, was legendary even among other legends, with roots as old as Greece itself. Whether it's Homer or Hesiod or Ovid, everyone talked about her and retold her story over hundreds and hundreds of years. And therein might lie the problem. The fullest version of Medusa's origin story that is most well known today is that she was one of the three Gorgons, the daughters of the sea gods Keto and Phorkys. Of the three Gorgons, only Medusa was mortal, and she was said to once have been a beautiful woman with the loveliest hair. One day, the Olympian sea god Poseidon had sex with Medusa in the temple of the virgin goddess Athena, or he might have forced himself on Medusa. We'll elaborate on this very soon, I promise. Either way, the fact that this happened in Athena's temple greatly offended Athena, who then turned Medusa's hair into snakes, and generally made her so monstrous that anyone who looked at her face turned into a stone statue. Medusa lived on an island with her sisters and turned some people to stone until the hero Perseus chopped off her head for a quest, and then used her head to turn some people to stone, and when he was done with the head, Athena took it and placed it on her aegis, where it continues to frighten Athena's enemies. So, you know the drill by now. What's the context? Who wrote this? When did they wrote this? Why did they wrote this? Well, as I said, a bit of the problem is that a lot of people wrote this, except that it turns out that, again, only one guy specifically wrote a whole bunch of this. One guy specifically wrote pretty much all of the parts of this that are kind of fucked up. Like, let's unpack this a little bit. If Medusa was already born as a Gorgon with two Gorgon sisters, why did Athena have to turn her into a Gorgon? Were her two sisters monstrous creatures already, while Medusa herself was still a beautiful woman? Were all of them originally beautiful women, and then Athena turned all three of these sisters into monsters for what one of them did? So, as of this recording, Wikipedia will tell you that this is exactly what happened. Athena did in fact turn all three of them, but that's actually verifiably untrue. Like, we know that Greek mythology has no canon, but as I said, it turns out that there is only one source for this part of the story, and it's very clear that Medusa was specifically and individually the only one that Athena targeted. What, something is wrong on the internet, on the Wikipedia? I know, try not to be too shocked. We also have to touch on the Poseidon thing, namely the question of whether Poseidon raped Medusa or not, because there are differing accounts of that as well, which is kind of a big deal because it changes just about every aspect of every element of every character's behavior in this story. Did Poseidon get together with an actual lover, or did he force himself on some poor unwilling girl? Did Athena punish a prideful mortal who knowingly defiled her temple, or did she victim blame some poor unwilling girl for her own assault? And for once, we can't just blame differing versions of this story for there being different versions of this story, because part of the problem may also have come from translation. See, one translation of the story says that Medusa was, quote, violated by Poseidon. And another translation of, well, not a different version or anything, but the same exact text, says instead that Poseidon attained her love. This is another problem that you'll run into with ancient texts, where one thing can have different meanings and different things can have the same meaning, and we're all at the mercy of translators making their best, most educated analyses of something no one can quite know for sure, otherwise known as guesses. Now, there are some schools of academic thought that say rape was not an actual defined concept in ancient times, and the word they used for rape may have also meant anything from abduction to seduction to even just courtship, and the only way to tell what little difference there was to these ancient writers is through context. Like, even the word violation, which has clear negative connotations for us, may have been used because sex in general was a violation of a woman regardless of her consent, which is its own other can of worms. So it might also have been that certain scenes in mythology that depict rape may have been intended as depictions of what we'd consider consensual courtship today. Having said that, I'm personally not super duper sure how much I buy into these admittedly well-researched studies. Like, ancient Greece had laws against sex crimes pretty early on, so the idea that their writers couldn't clearly delineate between sex that people did or didn't want, the idea that they didn't have the language to express what was rape or not rape, I don't know. I'm totally down with the notion that different cultures just have different ideas about things, and that ancient cultures particularly had very different moral compasses than us. But this specifically feels, in my opinion, like making the ancient Greeks out to be somehow alien and other from us in order to, well, alleviate our own discomfort about the amount of rape that was in their myths. Like, let's be very honest that so many gods, Poseidon included, did this a lot. Even if he didn't do it in this one version of this one myth, and I'm not saying he did or didn't, that still leaves like the 30 other times that he and a whole lot of other gods and heroes still did. It's one of the biggest foibles of Greek mythology, the thing that turns people off from it the most, very understandably, and so I think there might also be attempts to not downplay it exactly, but almost to rationalize this somehow in order to make mythology more palatable to people who enjoy reading mythology. A little like what I'm doing here, to be honest, as in, looking for the context that makes this all a bit more understandable. But the thing is that for us today to point at ancient mythology and claim that it had a bit too many rapes for comfort is a bit like, hello pot meet kettle, you know what I mean? Does this not also happen a lot in our modern fiction? Do our storytellers today not also fill our stories with sex crimes depicted for drama, for conflict and horror, or even for titillation? Sure, you might say that these sorts of things seem to have been depicted a bit more excessively on average in the old myths, but I don't know, again, if the only modern literature that someone had access to was the works of Alan Moore, they might also come away with a bit of a skewed impression of the kinds of stuff that modern people are prone to writing and reading about, Sure, we could say perhaps that ancient people did have such a different view on morality and sexuality and consent that not only did they not see sexual assault in the same way we do today, but that their very language was incompatible with the way we talk about consent and sexual acts. But then, Part of my whole purpose here is to actually try and demystify and de-alienate and de-otherify mythological literature the best that I can, and not to make them seem even less understandable. And so making out the ancient poets as being particularly more prone than we are today to writing about crude and obscene acts is kind of throwing rocks from glass houses, if you ask me. And saying that we just don't really understand what they meant when they depicted rape in these stories is like, I think we do. It's not so hard to understand. We have R-rated material today, too. We have a lot of it. Do we today handle it any more sensitively or thoughtfully than they used to? I don't know. What do you think, dear audience? Point being, in my opinion, I do not think that writers like Hesiod and Ovid were speaking a whole other language or something when they depicted these acts in their stories. I think they knew exactly what they were doing and were pretty clear about the content of their stories, in the same way that modern stories containing rape are also usually pretty clear about whatever response that they want to evoke from the audience, whether it be anxiety or disgust or melodrama or, yes, even titillation. Still, maybe there is some sort of middle ground, some sort of context that I'm missing that would make this all clearer. And I should also make it clear that I do actually also understand what the academics mean when they talk about rape not quite being the same thing to these ancient writers as we might think of, and that, moreover, this sort of analysis is probably a bit above my pay grade anyway. Which is nothing. I don't get paid for this. Anyway, back to the context behind Medusa. So the very first time that we hear about Medusa is from our boy Homer, roughly 800 years BC, probably. Now, he doesn't give any real backstory for Medusa, and in fact doesn't even call her Medusa. He simply refers to a very fearsome monster called Gorgo, or the Gorgon. We hear that the Trojan prince Hector has frightening, glaring eyes like a Gorgon, and Odysseus is afraid of possibly encountering a Gorgon when he ventures into the underworld. Homer also talks about how Athena has the fearsome, monstrous Gorgon on her aegis to frighten enemies with, but also mentions how an image of the Gorgon appears on the shield of Agamemnon, the main Greek king. Put a mental bookmark on this bit because it'll be important later, but for now, our two main takeaways is that Homer's Gorgon is a somewhat generic, frightening, hellish underworld monster who may or may not be female, much less a previously beautiful woman. There's also nothing here about turning people to stone quite yet, but we also can't completely discount that these elements might simply be things that Homer didn't bother to mention because he thinks it's just common knowledge to the audience. See, that's the second takeaway, that Homer talks about the Gorgon as if he expects the audience to already be familiar with this creature and its story, which means that anything about the Gorgon, or Gorgons plural, would have already been established in Greece long before Homer, which, as we'll find out, is in fact the case. Homer refers to Perseus in the same way, like he name drops this hero guy but doesn't go into any major details, as if Perseus is already a household name that the audience should just obviously already know. Alright, jump forward maybe 100 years, probably, we think, to Hesiod, who does explain Medusa a little bit more, because he just loves explaining things. He's the one who first tells us about Medusa's name, along with her two Gorgon sisters, and family lineage, and where she actually lives. And he goes into a little bit more detail about Perseus killing her, including the parts where Pegasus and some guy named Chrysaor spring from her neck stump after she dies. See, Hesiod is the one who first mentions Poseidon having been with Medusa, and he actually describes it as Poseidon lying with her in a soft meadow and among spring flowers, which signals to me that he was intending for this to come across as pleasant and romantic and consensual, so, there's that context too. Anyway, yeah, go ahead and add was pregnant with Poseidon's children, a horse with wings, and a guy on the big list of Medusa factoids. Still, there's nothing here about any of this happening in Athena's temple, and then Athena being angry about it and turning her into a monster. Medusa was, at this point, still always a monster, and in fact, Hesiod tells us the exact place that Medusa and Poseidon did the deed, and it was in a field of flowers, not some god's temple. So far, the only actual connection between Athena and Medusa is that Athena helped Perseus to kill this monster and then put her head on the Aegis, which isn't nothing, but it's also not exactly a very notable or exciting relationship. Now, did Hesiod, like Homer, simply recount the existing mythology about Medusa that everyone already knew at this time, or did he in fact invent all of these new details about Medusa's lore as if he was rebooting Medusa's continuity? More to the point, are there more things that he didn't mention at this time about Medusa, like perhaps a more dramatic relationship with Athena that were also already part of Medusa's lore? The fact is that we can't know for sure, which is always a very boring answer. Subjectively speaking, though, considering Hesiod's pretty thorough styles of description and the fact that his whole shtick was to talk about why these characters were the way that they were, I think it would be pretty weird if he did in fact know of some incredibly important aspect of Medusa's origin, like her possibly having been turned into a monster for offending Athena, and he just forgot to bring it up. My arguably educated guess is that this part of the story simply didn't exist at this point, and not that it was conspicuously missing from Hesiod's and everyone else's accounts for some reason. So who did actually eventually bring the drama? Let's not beat around the bush anymore. It was Ovid. Ovid is the only guy who wrote about all that stuff with Medusa and Athena in his epic poem, The Metamorphoses. And here we actually do know the exact date of origin. It was 8 AD. Jesus was 8 years old. We are roughly 700 years from the time that Hesiod wrote about Medusa, and 400 years after the height of classical Greece. I know that a lot of these historical dates feel very jumbled together, as if they're all taking place at roughly the same ancient Greek time, same ancient Greek channel, but just to be clear, there is roughly 800 years of difference between when Homer was writing the first known accounts of the Gorgon Medusa versus when Ovid was updating her for the post-Christ continuity. Just as an added reminder, Ovid was Roman. So not only did he not live in the same time period as these other Greek poets, he didn't even live in the same geographic peninsula. Now, it might sound like I'm trying to make it seem like Ovid's versions of mythology are somehow less real or legitimate than Homer's or Hesiod's renditions just because his stuff came later and he lived in the Roman Empire. And that's not actually the main point here. All of what we know of Greek mythology comes from all throughout ancient history and from all over the map. Nowadays, people like to stress the differences between ancient Greek and Roman mythology, and there are differences, but just to be clear, there are also differences between Attican mythology versus Arcadian mythology versus Boeotian mythology, all of which are regions of Greece, so the fact that Ovid was Roman gives his stories a different context, but doesn't make them any less real mythology, whatever that means. Again, for our analytical purposes, none of mythology is real. These are all made-up stories about made-up characters. The older versions of Medusa and Athena and Poseidon and everyone else are not somehow less made up than Ovid's 3.0 reiterations just because they are older. What I am trying to highlight here are the very different contexts that distinguish Ovid's Medusa from tellings that came beforehand. And from looking at all of these contexts and analyzing the rest of Ovid's work, it seems reasonable to deduce that he probably invented all of this newer stuff on his own. Like, we can't ever technically know for sure that some version of some story about Athena transforming Medusa didn't exist before Ovid, but it's about as obvious as you can get without actual direct evidence. Again, this does not mean that Ovid's Medusa is not a real Medusa story. He updated her for his time and put his own spin on her, added his own flourishes in order to tell the type of story that he wanted to tell to his audience. Kind of like Zack Snyder taking older established Superman origin stories and adding in a bunch of Zack Snyder-y stuff. Doesn't matter our opinion on it, unfortunately. It's still a real story that exists. But that does not mean that, just like with the DCEU, we can't also pick apart Ovid's work a little bit to scrutinize the strengths and weaknesses. See, Ovid has gotten a little bit of a negative reputation in mythology circles for kind of being the Zack Snyder or maybe the Rian Johnson of Greek mythology. You know, someone who had a huge influence on the genre, but whose interpretations and additions to the franchises are, let's just say, controversial. His take on Athena is just one example of these controversial flourishes, but it's probably the one that gets him the worst press. The thing is that to most contemporary readers, Athena seems like the coolest fucking god, right? She helps out all the heroes and is pretty much a goddess of unequivocally good things like being smart and being smart while doing arts and crafts and also being smart while fighting wars, to the point that today she even gets referred to as the goddess of just or noble warfare, which is actually also kind of a misconception, but hey, that's just what people believe. She seems, in theory, on the surface, to be an all-around lawful good goddess with the added bonus of acting as a sort of progressively feminist archetype, as a goddess who can do what the dude gods do, but better. A lot of the other gods in these myths have acted very poorly, very unsympathetically up to this point, and Athena hasn't been perfect, but had not seemed to do any, outright disgusting things up to this point. And then you find out about there being stories like what Ovid told here, and suddenly Athena seems less like a girl boss and more like a girl boss, what with her blaming a prospective victim of assault for her own assault and then punishing her for it, and then helping a male hero to chop off her head. And then there's also that myth of Arachne that you might have heard of. You know, it's that one where Arachne said she was a better weaver than Athena, and Athena gets mad, and they have a weaving contest, and Arachne actually wins the contest, but Athena is so pissed that she first beats the girl with a stick, and then after Arachne almost hangs herself from this treatment, takes pity on Arachne by turning her into a spider forever instead. It's another one of those etiological origin stories that take a lot of cues from other stories of gods being jealous about things and punishing mortals about it. And this time it's Athena's turn to be painted as particularly cruel and vindictive towards someone. And oh hey, did you know that this myth is also sourced exclusively to Ovid? Again, there is only one source for this story about Athena being a petty sore loser doling out spider transformations, and it's from this guy. Arachne is not mentioned anywhere else before this in the entire history of Greek literature. So, basically, two of the most notorious instances of the goddess Athena acting pretty arguably against type come from just this one guy and from nowhere else. Now, we know that Ovid did not just make up all of his myths. A lot of his poetry does tell about stuff that we know previous writers also talked about. And then there's the stuff that we hadn't heard of before Ovid, and there's no true objective way to tell if this was because he made all those parts up. This is not a weird Ovid exclusive thing either. As we've seen, most other poets also added their own takes and their own flourishes on top of existing lore. Remember, Medusa probably didn't even have a name before Hesiod came up with one, and may not have turned people to stone before who even knows. The thing about Ovid, though, is that he has a bias, and it's a noticeable enough bias that readers were talking about it even way back in his time and through the Middle Ages right up until modern times. Ovid, he did not have a positive opinion on authority figures. Details about this are unfortunately a bit unclear, but his sentiments against the ruling class may have eventually led to his exile from Rome by the emperor himself, and then, being treated this way probably exacerbated those sentiments. And so the theory that he probably projected these anti-authoritarian sentiments onto his ideas of the gods has become a bit widespread nowadays. Depicting the gods as crude, lecherous, petty, oversensitive bullies who abuse their power may have been Ovid's way to remark upon the way that the leaders and the emperors of his time were also behaving. This was the artistic narrative approach that this storyteller took, and it certainly came through in his works thematically, if not intentionally. Now, of course, if you're looking for stories where the gods are always the clear-cut good guys who should always be admired, if you're looking for sanitized depictions of mythology that are safely progressive about the topics that we're passionate about today, you probably shouldn't be reading ancient mythology, and may I interest you in some Disney adaptations instead. All of the gods, Athena included, were scandalous and overdramatic and dangerous characters who screwed with mortals in very unfair ways long before Ovid. Again, many of his stories are in fact retellings of the existing lore about the gods. The distinction is in what he chose to emphasize and how he emphasized those aspects, so that his telling of these characters came across as all the more unlikable and hypocritical. See, another similarity I've noticed between ancient mythology and modern fiction is how much writers can change impressions of a thing just by how they tell the story of the thing, just by what they choose to include and omit. There are a bajillion ways to portray even the most seemingly straightforward characters, and how writers choose to go about doing so can be very telling. It can be very biased, for better or for worse. The same story about the same things can come across very differently depending on how you tell it. And as far as Ovid is concerned, this becomes the difference between, for instance, depicting the gods' influence over mortal lives as them being divine arbiters of unyielding fate, which is how it tends to come across in a lot of other stories, versus making this seem as if the gods are just flawed beings who are no better than anyone else and therefore shouldn't be in charge, which is how Ovid tends to paint this. It's the difference between depicting Zeus's rambunctious appetites as him being very lordly and powerful and kingly, versus this making Zeus out to seem very horny and silly and unworthy. It's the difference between Poseidon lying down with Medusa in the field of spring flowers versus him violating her on the steps of a virgin goddess's temple. It's the difference of tone and portrayal that we can clearly analyze between someone like Hesiod, for instance, who was, by all accounts, a very pious and devout worshipper of the gods that he wrote about, regardless of what he wrote about them. And then there's someone like Ovid, who didn't have much use for bowing and scraping to hypocritical rulers who didn't deserve his respect. With Hesiod, it's flowery fields. With Ovid, the same scene is a sordid tale that makes everyone involved look terrible. To be clear, I also don't want to overstate the effects of Ovid's anti-authoritarian sentiments on his writing, even though I maybe kind of sort of just did do that, because of course nothing was quite that simple. The guy wasn't some sort of hardcore revolutionary, he was just a pretty passionate storyteller. A whole bunch of his works was actually love poetry. Those were what he was most known for during his lifetime, and they were prosy and elaborate and actually also pretty smutty for their time. And yes, this did include the poems of the Metamorphoses as well. So on top of everything else we've just analyzed about Ovid's takes on mythology, we also have to consider that he was trying to make them out to be perhaps a bit more provocative or porny than the average tales. So basically, Ovid has a reputation as being that guy who has a bit of an agenda, and it's not entirely unearned. Now, I would never say that his stories of Medusa and Arachne and everything else are somehow wrong or fake versions of real mythology. As we've seen, there are certainly many other myths that should probably be taken far less seriously, and it's not as if other writers didn't also have biases. But given all this sort of context we have as to why exactly Ovid's stuff was the way that it was, I don't blame anyone for seeing him as the odd man out amongst his myth-writing counterparts, as that guy for whom you'd be like, oh, you know that Ovid wrote this, right? Okay, just checking. So on the one hand, Ovid exercised his right as a creator and an artist to make powerful statements, however metaphorical, about his world and the flawed people who ran it. He was sticking it to the man and being horny about it at the same time. I can't rag on him for that. The fact that we might feel upset or unhappy about the gods acting so cruelly was the whole point. His through line was that anyone in power, with power, should not act in such ways, and if we feel that way about these fictional gods and their fictional unfair punishments of fictional mortals, we should definitely feel that way even more so about the real live people in power who rule over our real lives with impunity and pettiness. But on the other hand, this does still give his versions of mythology a somewhat different color, and we have to be cognizant of that when analyzing mythology. We have to be aware that his stories that have entered into modern compilations of Greek mythology as Greek mythology may not be very representative of Greek mythology, whether because they weren't actually Greek, or that they came very late in the game, or because of any other context that made Ovid into the special snowflake poet that he was. The first time I found out that these stories of Athena punishing Medusa and punishing Arachne are only found in this one guy's work, I was like, oh, for fuck's sake. Oh, no wonder what. That explains this. Now, in fairness, Ovid is certainly not the first writer to ever portray Athena as being weirdly anti-woman. I think that honor might go to Aeschylus, but he did have a habit of taking what might have been offbeat, forgettable foibles in existing stories and then blowing them up so that there's no way to avoid them. When writers do that nowadays, we tend to call it flanderizing or railroading. Like, no matter how much Ovid might have been a radical dude who made great statements with his art, he's probably also single-handedly responsible for some really weird impressions we might have about mythological figures. And let's also not overlook the very weird ways that he dealt with sexual interactions, by which I mean weird even by ancient mythology standards. I get that making these myths sordid and uncomfortable was the whole point, but the existing mythology was always already pretty darn misogynistic. Like, whether it's Homer or Hesiod or whoever else, they were already very sexist. So you have to really try in order to make this stuff even worse than it already was. The Medusa thing is just one of several examples of this, and we can't just brush off every single one of these instances, all of these depictions of nymphs being ravished and women being victimized, as Ovid trying to make some sort of statement against the establishment. Like I said, I think Ovid knew exactly what he was doing and focused so much on this sort of thing because at the end of the day, it made his stories more salacious and provocative and interesting in some kind of way. We do this today. Why would it have been any different back in ancient times? In recent times, there's been a lot of attempts in certain online communities to reclaim or recontextualize or reconstruct certain disempowering myths so that they end up depicting their goddesses or heroines in a more empowering light. You know the ones, it's the reimaginings where Hades abducting Persephone was actually consensual and romantic and somehow actually liberating for her. The ones that do analyze the myths as somehow being safely progressive about all the things. And as far as Medusa goes, there was this article or essay that reframed this story so that Athena was actually helping out Medusa by turning her into a snake-haired monster whose looks could literally kill. According to this version of the story, Athena was constrained by prevalent patriarchal systems and couldn't directly punish the male god Poseidon for assaulting Medusa, but she could pretend to punish Medusa for it by actually secretly giving her a fearsome power that would protect her from ever being hurt by men again. At first, I thought this take must have come from some random think piece or maybe a social media post that blew up somehow. And I was right! The earliest indication of this Athena helping Medusa story is from a 2017 blog post, so yeah, not particularly a stone-cold truth. But that said, the idea of Medusa re-envisioned as a protective feminist symbol has apparently been a thing since the 70s, and nowadays amulets or even tattoos of the Gorgon face have gotten kind of trendy, or perhaps I should say gotten kind of trendy again. Like, no, Athena secretly protecting Medusa from men is not the secret true story of anything. You just made that up. But we can actually see where this writer might have gotten the inkling of an impression of this from, because Medusa was, in fact, originally actually considered a sort of protective symbol. Remember how I said that Homer wrote about the Gorgon as if people should just generally know what a Gorgon is? Well, the fact is that we found images and sculptures of the Gorgon face, or the Gorgonion, from way back in history, long before Homer, like 700 to 1,000 years before, where it was used as a sort of apotropaic symbol, which means that it was used to ward off evil or protect you from other such bad mojo. Think of it as a gargoyle on a church building, or even the Oni of Japanese folklore. The idea is that this monstrous creature is so monstrous and therefore monstrously powerful that it can actually scare off or drive away other bad stuffs. This explains why Homer described King Agamemnon holding a shield with the fearsome Gorgon face on it, because even by this time, even before we knew any actual mythology about the Gorgon, it was already used commonly as a protective design. This also explains its presence on the aegis of Zeus and Athena. See, the Gorgonian was such a powerful symbol to strike fear into your enemies that it would appear on the person of these powerful gods as an indication of their power. My guess is that this is also when people first started to envision the aegis as an actual shield, because believe it or not, it wasn't originally a shield, which is what it's always depicted as nowadays. The aegis was originally something like a goatskin covering that you wore, but that you could wield defensively as a shield. Because that's how far back this sort of iconography comes from. We're literally at using animal skins as defense levels of ancient-ass antiquity here. So if you're wondering why artwork and sculptures of Athena and other figures have the Gorgon head on their armor shawls or even their scale mail or breastplates instead of on their big round shields, well, this is why. It's not that they forgot to put it on the shield, it's that the aegis was originally some sort of body protection instead of a shield. But of course, just to make things more difficult for us, the aegis was also depicted as a shield in ancient artwork as well, because yeah, you would in fact just put the Gorgonian on your shield as well. Again, my own theory is that because Homer wrote of the Gorgon being depicted on Zeus and Athena's goatskin aegis, as well as being on Agamemnon's shield, somehow this got a little conflated even back then as the aegis being a literal circular infantry shield. And it also probably didn't help matters that Athena, but not Zeus, was commonly shown carrying that exact type of shield in addition to her snaky body armor. So, to recap everything, Medusa was originally, back in antiquity, a protective, evil-warding design of a scary-looking face that you'd put onto things like buildings and shields that Homer described as a sort of underworld monster whose face appears on Zeus's goatskin aegis that Athena sometimes wears. Then Hesiod filled in all the details about who this monster actually was, including her name and lineage and the part where she was Poseidon's lover in some capacity, but then killed by Perseus. And then centuries later, Ovid revised this backstory so that she was originally a beautiful woman who was raped by Poseidon at Athena's temple, which Athena then punished her for. And then a couple of millenniums later, her story and iconography starts to get reclaimed by feminist authors as an icon of their rage and pain, which led to someone coming up with this new interpretation where Athena's punishment was actually her secretly giving Medusa some superpowers. And that's what you missed on Glee. At the end of the day, I'm not super concerned with what version of whatever myth people like over the others, even if it might just be something they made up themselves. I just think it's important to know all of the context here. I don't actually think I'm that much of a mythology purist. Like, honestly, make up whatever you want. It's all made up anyway. But just be aware of what parts were made up and by whom. There's a difference between saying that mythology has no canon and saying that literally anything can be mythological canon. If you like the modernized woman protecting Athena Medusa story because it's just a better story to you, that's fantastic and also probably accurate. But if you like it because you think it's somehow secretly the real story of Medusa and Athena that secretly speaks to their secret pro-women origins, it's not. It's an outright reimagining. Like, I can see why someone might have gotten this impression if they're only seeing the connections without the context. Like, hey, the Gorgonian was an ancient protective symbol, so clearly it was given to the Gorgon to protect herself with. But no, this is modern fanfiction. There's 0% chance that this is why Ovid added the stuff that he added. Still, I think there is something charming and appropriate about the notion that something that was originally a symbol of protection and then became a very dramatic story has then turned all the way back around to becoming used once again as a protective icon. Sure, it wasn't used in ancient times for protecting women specifically, but someone might as well make use of it, and it might as well be women who are reimagining a toxic story as something else. Just, don't tell me that the reimagining is the real story, because I will go to your house and drink all your milk. So, what have we learned today? Well, again, the main thing I wanted to do here, and I don't know how well this may have come across, is to demystify Greek mythology a little bit, to impress upon people that a lot of it is not actually so different from modern genres of literature. Storytellers back then are not spectacularly different from storytellers today, and so their works are a lot more understandable than they first might seem. If you can get the gist of the MCU or the Arrowverse, you can probably decipher these old yarns. And if you can't, well, it's not actually super duper hard to do your own research on this stuff. The best website for this sort of thing, the one that has the best rep and that everyone swears by, is probably theoi.com. It's a massive compilation of mythological minutiae, and best of all, everything on there is sourced. It lists primary sources, it cites directly from the ancient texts to leave as little room for modernistic interpretations as possible. On the flip side, this does make its sources a little difficult to parse if you're not used to reading the oldest and the timiest of old-timey speech. Like, here's a sample passage about Ares from Quintus Smyrnaeus. Ares to gory strife he speedeth, wroth with foes, when maddeneth his heart, and grim his frown is, and his eyes flash 11 flame around him, and his face is clothed with the glory of beauty, terror blent, as on he rusheth, quail the very gods. Okay, calm down, Quintus. My advice would be to approach this website with an open mind. There's going to be information on here that contradicts what you think you already know. It's going to refer to Zeus as the god of fate, and you're going to be like, what? That's not true. Everyone knows that even Zeus has to obey the fates, and it's like, sort of, but also not really. Or it's going to say that Hephaestus is just Hera's son and doesn't have a father, and you're going to be like, okay, that's gotta be wrong. Everyone knows that Zeus is Hephaestus' father, and, well, actually, that was the minority opinion in ancient times, so on and so forth. Mythology has no canon. Now, that being said, I'm gonna equivocate a little bit here and mention that you should not just trust everything you read on theoi.com either. This is probably gonna be a little controversial, but I have to say that even a really good site like this can be a little biased about stuff, and there's going to be bits and pieces that seem to be subjective interpretations of mythology instead of objective research, so you still have to be careful of what you read, especially if there's no direct source for something it mentions, and especially when it comes to the passages on the lesser-known gods. One example of this that comes to mind is the passage on the Titan goddess Arke. According to theoi.com, Arke was the messenger of the Titan gods and sister of the rainbow goddess Iris. During the Titan Wars, the two goddesses served on opposite sides. Iris became the messenger of the Olympian gods, and Arke assumed the role of messenger of the Titans. At the end of the war, Zeus stripped her of her wings and cast her into the pit of Tartarus. Arke may have represented the faded secondary rainbow, which is sometimes seen in the sky in the shadow of the first. So, first of all, that sounds hella metal, right? She's like a dark rainbow goddess who sided with the Titans. That's badass. That sounds like the sort of thing that should appear in more adaptations of myths. Now, if we look at their source for this bit, we can see that there's only one source, only one guy who ever said something like this, but that part's not that weird. We're used to that at this point. Maybe he made it up, maybe he didn't. The problem is that this guy in the source, Ptolemy Hephaestion, did not say a single thing about Arke representing any kind of rainbow, dark, or secondary, or anything else. This seems to be a completely subjective interpretation of her role by the writers of this site. It's certainly a possible interpretation, and probably a scholarly one as well, but, we don't know that. There's only one source for this goddess, and even if we assume Hephaestion didn't just make her up, we can't also just put words into his mouth that he didn't actually say. Arke may have represented the secondary rainbow, but the words may have are doing a whole lot of heavy lifting here. There are a couple other instances of this kind of guesswork. Another general concept that recurs throughout this site is the idea that the Titans, particularly Cronus' 4 brothers, actually represent the cardinal directions, as in the 4 heavenly pillars that hold up the axis of the world. So the Titan Koios represents the north, Hyperion represents the west, Iapetos is the east, and Krios is the south. I've seen this interpretation pop up in some other places as well, and it's a very interesting and poetic conception of the Titan gods, and y'all should definitely be yoinking this idea for your mythological adaptations, but I could not find a single actual source for any of it. This idea of the male Titan brothers representing cardinal directions seems to be a very creative imagining of their mythological significance, with some sort of etymological backing, but it's also basically nothing. There's nothing from ancient sources suggesting that this was what the Titans were. There might be some sort of contemporary academic analysis of this sort of thing that I wasn't able to find, but even so, it would have to be a pretty niche study of some very obscure cultic iconography. There's just no evidence that anyone in ancient Greece actually saw the Titans this way or had any lore about this on the local level, much less on a wider cultural scale. Again, I see a lot of this kind of thing with the lesser known gods. It's easy to check for bullshit on Athena or Hermes, but the less mainstream you get, the more that you can simply say whatever the hell you want and people will just believe it, because how do they know it's not real? A good rule of thumb is that if something sounds like a modern invention, it probably is. I say that Greek mythology is very comparable with modern literature, but they were also still written 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, and were not progressive about issues, and were not written with modern sensibilities about issues in mind. I don't even have time here to go into the notorious instance where Tumblr just invented a fake Greek goddess and people thought she was real. Well, actually, that's pretty much the whole story. Tumblr invented a fake goddess and people believed it. The end. Also, be careful of people being overly poetic about mythology. By which I mean people saying that this myth is supposed to represent something or another, or that there's some sort of deep psychological, metaphysical meaning behind a certain myth beyond what is immediately apparent, which is almost always going to be someone's personal, artistic interpretation of mythology. Of course, much of mythology originally came from poetry, but most of this ancient poetry described events in very literal, concrete ways. So anyone ascribing any particularly profound emotional meanings to these events is going to be doing a lot of subjective analysis. This is how we end up thinking that the Titans are cardinal directions or something. Another similar example I'm thinking of is the story of the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed, 100-headed giant sons of Gaia and Uranus. And there are a couple of sites out there saying that these guys originally couldn't control themselves because they had so many heads, and that this made them so chaotic and wild that they couldn't think straight until Zeus gave them a clear purpose so that they could fully control their bodies and finally help the gods win the Titan War. So these hundred-handed, hundred-headed giants sort of represent internal chaos and the conflict within people when they don't have clear guidance to help guide them, right? Now, I always liked the myth of the Hecatoncheires. I always liked how one of the very first things Zeus ever did was to help his monstrous uncles and how they helped him in return. But this part about him giving them reason and helping them master their minds and bodies is an embellishment. It is made up. It is an adaptation of the ancient stories, none of which originally said that the Hecatoncheires couldn't control themselves or something until Zeus helped. I don't hate this embellishment. It is a very cool additional dramatization of the ancient mythology that adds further poetic significance to these characters, which one might say it is the purpose of mythology to stimulate our imaginations in these ways. But the context is still that this is a modern, rebooted telling of the original story. It is not the secret, true inner meaning of the hundred-handed ones in any way other than a completely subjective reinterpretation that someone just made up. So, like, what are you supposed to do when even the best sites on the internet, like theoi.com and also tumblr.com, can be selectively misleading? I don't know, man. What should any of us do at the end of the day? The good news is that if you really love mythology and enjoy learning about it, the information is out there, and there's always new information to enjoy learning about. Like, if you've managed to make it this far into this video, I think you're doing alright for yourself. A lot of hardcore mythology researchers will probably warn you against watching too many YouTube videos about this sort of thing because they tend to be either overly simplistic or generalizing when they aren't just flat out getting things wrong. But you know what? I'm not super against it as a starting point, and I'm also not just saying that because I am literally making YouTube videos. I love watching video essays on mythology. If I didn't know what people were saying wrong, how would I know what to be pretentiously angry about? You just gotta be careful of the misinformation. Be skeptical of everything. Be skeptical of me. Cross-reference the shit that I say to make sure I'm not just making things up. Always be aware of the context. Who wrote this? When did they write this? Why did they write this? Every little bit of lore we have on these old stories just has a source that you can find. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. It's something that I've wanted to make for a while now, and I really do want to make more stuff like this. For now though, go out there and learn yourself some myths. Be careful of Pliny though, that guy is full of shit. When I talked about some mythology coming from completely unreliable sources, I was thinking very specifically of Pliny the Elder. No, I will not elaborate at this time. Thanks for watching, guys.